There is a barn on the edge of Hardin County that most people drive past without looking twice. It sits back from the road about 40 yards half hidden behind a row of cottonwood trees that Earl Maddox's grandfather planted in 1921 because he believed trees were the first sign that a man intended to stay somewhere. The barn is old. The boards have gone gray, the way wood goes gray in Iowa slowly and without complaint, the color deepening each winter until it becomes something close to the color of a storm cloud sitting low on the horizon. The hinges on the main door are original hand-forged iron that Earl oils twice a year, whether they need it or not, because that is what his father taught him, and his father's father taught him. And in that family, the things worth keeping were the things worth maintaining. Every morning, before he does anything else, before he starts the coffee or pulls on his boots or looks at what the sky is doing, Earl Maddox walks to that barn. He does not hurry. He never hurries. He walks the way a man walks when he knows exactly where he is going and has no interest in arriving before he is ready. The gravel under his feet makes a particular sound in the early morning, a sound that is different from the sound it makes at noon or in the evening, crisper, somehow more deliberate, as if the ground itself is paying attention. He pushes the barn door open and stands in the threshold for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the interior darkness. And there in the far left corner, where the morning light from the single east-facing window falls at an angle across the concrete floor, sits the tractor. It is a 1961 International Harvester Farmall 560. That is what the paperwork says at any rate. What the paperwork does not say, what no paperwork anywhere in Iowa or Illinois or Indiana says, is what this particular machine actually is, beneath its faded red paint and its carbon-stained exhaust stack and its left rear fender held in place with a length of baling wire since the winter of 1974. The paperwork does not say that, and Earl has never told anyone, and on the morning of August 18th, 1979, he has kept that secret for 8 years. He walks to the tractor and places his right hand flat against the engine block. It is cool at this hour, the metal having given up its heat to the night air, and he stands there for a moment with his hand pressed against it, the way you might press your hand against the shoulder of someone who does not need words, only presence. Then he steps back, nods once at nothing in particular, and goes inside to make the coffee. This is who Earl Maddox is. He is not a complicated man, but he is not a simple one either. He is the kind of man who is difficult to understand until the moment you understand him completely, and then you wonder how you ever missed it. He was born in the spring of 1935 on the same 280 acres of Hardin County land his family had been farming for 16 years by that point. His grandfather, a man named Clement Weston, who went by Clem and never used 2 words when one would do, had come to Iowa from a failed homestead in Nebraska in 1919 with a wife, 2 children, $40 in his coat pocket, and the particular kind of stubbornness that looks like stupidity from the outside and looks like character from the inside. He had worked as a hired hand for 15 years before he saved enough to buy 160 acres of his own. His son Earl's father had worked alongside him and eventually expanded that to 280 acres, paying off the last loan note in 1950 and burning it in the kitchen stove on a cold February evening, with Earl watching from the doorway, 12 years old, and not quite understanding what he was seeing, but understanding that it mattered. Earl's father died in 1965, leaving him the land and the equipment and the debts, which amounted to nothing because there were no debts. That was the inheritance that mattered most, not the 280 acres, not the machinery, not the farmhouse with its uneven floors and its windows that stuck in the summer humidity. What his father left him was a way of being in the world. You do not owe what you cannot pay. You do not take what you have not earned. You do not speak louder than the work speaks for you. Earl had taken these things to heart, the way some men take religion to heart, not as rules imposed from outside, but as descriptions of something already true about themselves that had simply been given words. He had competed in the Hardin County Fair tractor pull back in the late 1960s when his father was still alive. He had done well enough to know he was capable, not so well that it went to his head, which was not a place it would have gone anyway. When his father died, he stopped entering. It was not grief exactly, or not only grief. It was that the pull had been something he and his father did together, a thing that belonged to a particular time, and that time was over. He put his energy into the land and the machinery and the slow, patient work of maintaining both, and for 14 years that was enough. He never married. There had been a woman once a school teacher from Ackley named Doris, and they had spent 2 years circling around something that might have become a life together, but she had wanted to move to Des Moines, and he had never once considered it, and in the end they had parted without anger, which is sometimes the saddest kind of parting because it means there was nothing to fight for except incompatible futures. After Doris, he did not try again. He was not unhappy. He simply organized his life around different things. He read. He maintained his equipment with a precision that other farmers in the county found either admirable or excessive, depending on who you asked. He drove into Eldora on Saturday mornings for groceries and sat at the counter at Patton's Diner for exactly 1 cup of coffee, speaking to whoever was there returning home by noon. He did not seek company, but he was not unfriendly. He was simply accounted for, already his hours spoken for by the land and the machines that worked it. And there was no resentment in that accounting, only the quiet satisfaction of a man living inside the dimensions of his own character. He had not entered the tractor pull since 1967. That was 12 years. Most people in Hardin County had simply stopped thinking of him as a competitor. He was Earl Maddox, the man with the old Farmall, the man who kept to himself, the man who had not borrowed a dime in his life. That was how they knew him. That was all they thought they knew. Now it is necessary to talk about the secret, because the secret is the spine of everything that follows, and without understanding it, you cannot understand Earl, and without understanding Earl, you cannot understand what happened on the afternoon of August 18th, 1979, and why it mattered for the next 30 years. In the winter of 1971, the Farmall threw a cracked head gasket. This is not an unusual thing. Engines crack gaskets. It is the nature of machines under sustained load in extreme temperatures, the kind of temperatures Iowa produces with indifferent regularity, brutal cold in winter, punishing heat in summer, and the gasket on the Farmall had finally given way during a particularly hard December. Earl pulled the tractor into the barn, let the engine cool, and began disassembling the top end to replace the gasket. This was work he had done before on other machines. He was methodical about it, laying each component out on a clean workbench in the order it came off, which is the only way to do engine work if you want to get it right when you put it back together. When he pulled the cylinder head, he stopped. He stood there in the barn with the head in his hands and the cold coming through the walls and the single work light swaying slightly in a draft. And he looked at what he was holding and he looked at the block beneath it, and he knew that something was wrong. Not wrong in a bad way necessarily, but wrong in the sense of not matching what he expected. The cylinders had been bored out. The pistons were different from any Farmall 560 pistons he had ever seen, heavier, with a compression ratio that did not correspond to any specification in the service manual he had on the shelf. The camshaft, when he got to it, had a profile he had never seen before, a lift and duration that was not in any catalog. He was not an engineer, but he had been working on this engine for 9 years by that point, and he knew it the way, a voice you have heard thousands of times well enough to know when something unfamiliar is speaking. He put the engine back together with a new gasket and spent the rest of that winter making telephone calls. He called the dealer in Cedar Rapids where his father had bought the machine in 1963. He called International Harvester's customer service line in Chicago. He wrote letters. He was politely told more than once that he must be mistaken, that all production Farmall 560s were built to factory standard specifications. He persisted. He eventually found a retired engineer named Harold Swick, who had worked at the IH plant in Rock Island during the early 1960s, and Harold Swick, after 2 long telephone conversations, told him the truth. International Harvester in 1962 and 1963 was developing what would become the Farmall 706. It was to be a larger, more powerful tractor, the successor to the 560 series. To test components and configurations for the new engine, the engineering team had taken a batch of production 560 frames and fitted them with prototype parts, bored cylinders, high compression pistons, experimental camshaft profiles. These were not show tractors. They were not demonstration units. They were working test mules sent into the field to accumulate hours and data under real conditions. When the 706 program concluded, most of these test mules were supposed to be returned to the factory for disassembly. Most of them were. But IH in those years was not running a tight inventory on internal fleet assets. A handful of units had been routed through the dealer network by mistake, sold as used standard 560s, their engineering history unknown to the dealers who sold them and the farmers who bought them. Earl's father had bought one of them in Cedar Rapids in 1963 for $2,800. He had driven it for 2 years before he died and never once suspected it was anything other than what the dealer told him it was. He simply thought he had bought a tractor that ran exceptionally well. The modifications Harold Swick told Earl would have brought the engine output from the standard 60 horsepower to somewhere between 85 and 90 horsepower depending on conditions. It was not a dramatic machine by the standards of the new equipment being manufactured in 1971, let alone what was coming in 1979. It was not going to set any records against a modern turbocharged diesel in ideal conditions, but it was considerably more tractor than it appeared to be. And in a tractor pull where the competition was class-based and the 560 would be pulling against machines, it had no business being in the same field with those extra horsepower were not nothing. Earl thanked Harold Swick, hung up the telephone, and sat in his kitchen for a long time without moving. He did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell particularly, and no reason to tell them. The tractor pulled what he needed it to pull. It worked the land the way the land needed to be worked. The fact that it was carrying a secret inside its engine block was between him and the machine and no one else. That was how it stayed for 8 years, until August 18th, 1979. Now it is necessary to talk about Harlan Denton, because a story about a man like Earl Maddox only becomes a story when it collides with a man like Harlan Denton, and the collision that happened on that August afternoon had been building for 30 years, even if neither man knew it until the moment it happened. Harlan Denton was 49 years old in August of 1979. He was 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, in the way of men who have worked outdoors their whole lives and have never quite lost the physical confidence that comes from that kind of work. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been designed to make declarations. He wore boots that cost more than most farmers in Hardin County spent on a month of groceries. He drove a new pickup truck every 2 years and made sure everyone knew it was new, not by saying so directly, which would have been crass, but by keeping it clean in the particular aggressive way that communicates to other men that this truck matters, that everything about this man matters, that he is operating at a different level than the men around him. The Denton family had been in Hardin County since the turn of the century. Harlan's grandfather had accumulated land the way some men accumulate land during lean times, which is to say he had bought it from men who needed money more than they needed acreage, which is a transaction that can be viewed as opportunism or pragmatism, depending on which side of the desk you are sitting on. By 1979, the Denton family owned 2,200 acres of prime north-central Iowa farmland, and Harlan had spent most of his adult life ensuring that everyone in the county was aware of this fact. He sat on the county board. He sat on the co-op board. He sat on the finance committee at First Lutheran and had his name on a plaque in the fellowship hall acknowledging a contribution that he reminded people of with considerably more frequency than was strictly necessary. He had won the Hardin County Fair tractor pull in 1976, 1977, and 1978, each time with a newer and more expensive machine, and he had accepted each trophy as though it was confirmation of something he had always known about himself and felt the world was finally catching up to acknowledging. His John Deere 4440, delivered from the dealership in Ames in the spring of 1979, was the machine he had been waiting for. A turbocharged 466 cubic inch diesel putting out over 130 horsepower at the PTO, power shift transmission, factory air conditioning, a sound dampened cab that cost more than $12,000 on its own. The sticker price, not including options, was north of $45,000. Harlan had mentioned the price to at least a dozen different people in the weeks since the delivery, always in a context that made it seem incidental, always with the particular casualness that is not casual at all. He fully expected to win his fourth consecutive title that afternoon. What he did not expect, what no one expected, was the name on the competitor registration list that had appeared that morning at Clara's desk. Earl Maddox. Clara had been the registration clerk at the Hardin County Fair since 1968. She was a sturdy woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the kind of institutional memory for local names and local history that small Iowa counties produce in certain people who stay put long enough to accumulate it. She had known Earl Maddox since he was in grade school. She had known his father. She knew the Farmall 560 the way you know a car you have seen parked in the same driveway for 15 years. When Earl came to her table at 7:45 in the morning, Entry fee in hand, she looked at the tractor he had driven in and parked in the staging area, and she said what anyone who knew the situation would have said. She said, "Earl, you know this is the open class. You know what you are going up against." He said, "I know." She said that Farmall has to be pushing 20 years old. Close to it. She paused. "It runs fine." He said, "She runs fine." Clara looked at the tractor again, the rust streaks on the hood, the exhaust stack that was more carbon than metal, the baling wire on the left rear fender catching the morning light. She looked back at Earl. She took his $25. He walked back to the staging area and waited. The other competitors began arriving between 8 and 9. There were 15 entries in the open class that year. A pair of case tractors from farmers over in Grundy County who had been talking about this pull since March. An International 1466 that a man named Gerald Burke had spent the better part of the spring preparing, pulling the injection pump and having it rebuilt, adjusting the timing. A Massey Ferguson that had been visibly modified, the hood sitting slightly higher than factory to accommodate something underneath that its owner was not discussing, and Harlan Denton's John Deere 4440, which arrived on a flatbed trailer at 9:15 and was unloaded with the kind of deliberate theatricality that requires an audience and generally finds one. When Harlan walked the staging area and found Earl's Farmall parked in the corner, he stopped. He looked at the tractor for a moment, the way a man looks at something he is deciding whether to bother taking seriously. Then he walked around it slowly. He kicked one of the rear tires. He shook his head slightly, clicked his tongue, the universal vocabulary of theatrical disappointment. He said, "Earl Maddox, I did not know they were taking museum pieces this year." Walt Pruitt, who was standing 20 feet away, leaning against his Oliver, did not laugh. Walt was farming 320 acres on a loan that he was not certain he was going to be able to service come harvest, and he had his own memories of Harlan Denton at an auction in 1977, standing next to Walt's neighbor's equipment with a checkbook and a patient expression. Harlan either did not notice the silence from Walt or did not care. He turned back to Earl. He said, "You know what that thing is worth, Earl? Maybe $150. Scrap price." Earl looked at him. His face was the face of a man who has decided in advance not to give a particular conversation more than it deserves. He said nothing. Harlan said, "I will give you $500 for it right now. Cash. You can walk away. Save yourself the embarrassment. I will put it in my barn. Something to show people." Earl said, "It is not for sale." Harlan laughed. He had a laugh that carried. "Not for sale, Earl. In about 3 hours that thing is not going to be worth the diesel in its tank." Earl said, "We will see." He turned and walked back to the water cooler at the edge of the staging area. He filled a paper cup and drank it standing up, looking out across the fairgrounds at the midway, where children were already beginning to fill the space between the rides and the food stands and the whole county fair. Smell of August was in the air. Popcorn and manure and engine oil and cut grass and something sweet that might have been funnel cakes from the stand near the main gate. He had made his decision 3 weeks earlier. He had not made it impulsively. Earl Maddox did not do anything impulsively. He had made it the way he made all decisions, by sitting with it for a long time and examining it from every angle until he understood what it was actually about. He had been thinking about Harlan Denton for a long time, not obsessively, not with anger which was not in his nature, but with the slow, careful attention he gave to problems that needed solving but could not be hurried. He had watched Harlan for years, watched the way he moved through the county, Watch the auctions where he appeared with his checkbook. Watch the way he spoke to men who were struggling, as though their struggle was a confirmation of something he already believed about them. Watch the way he wore his land and his money and his equipment like armor that he had convinced himself made him more than what he was. Earl did not hate him. He had thought about this carefully and concluded that hatred was too simple and too energetic a response to what he actually felt. What he felt was something quieter and more persistent. He felt that Harlan Denton had spent 30 years confusing wealth with worth, and that no one had ever shown him the difference in a language he could not dismiss or rationalize away. Words would not do it, the county board would not do it, the co-op meetings would not do it. The only language that would reach Harlan Denton was the language he believed in completely, which was the language of competition, of winning and losing, of public accounting. Earl had entered the tractor pull because it was the only arena where those two things, wealth and worth, could be separated in front of witnesses. He had entered it knowing something that Harlan did not know. He had entered it with 8 years of patience in his back pocket, and a secret in the engine block of a machine that most people in Hardin County would not have given $200 for at a private sale. He had entered it not to destroy Harlan Denton, but to show him something true about the world that Harlan had spent his life successfully avoiding. That was all Earl wanted. That was the whole of it. The tractor pull began at 2 o'clock with the lighter divisions. Earl sat in the shade of the cottonwood trees at the north end of the infield and watched the smaller tractors work. The track. Listened to the crowd in the grandstands responding to each pull with the particular rhythms of a fair crowd rising and falling, the burst of enthusiasm for a good run, the collective groan for a short one. He ate a sandwich he had brought from home. He drank water from a thermos. He did not speak to anyone except to exchange brief greetings with Walt Pruitt, who came and sat beside him for a few minutes in the early afternoon. Walt said, "You sure about this?" It was not a question, but Earl answered it anyway. He said, "I am sure." Walt looked at the Farmall parked 20 yards away in the staging area. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is trying to decide whether to trust. Then he nodded once and got up and walked back toward the grandstands. By 3:30 the afternoon heat had settled in fully. The temperature was in the low 90s. The air had the thick, still quality that Iowa air gets in August when there is no wind, when the heat just sits on everything like a weight. The shadows from the cottonwoods had shortened and hardened. Sweat was soaking through shirts in the grandstands. The smell of the crowd mixed with the exhaust from the tractors that had been running since noon. Harlan Denton spent the early afternoon working the grandstands. He moved through the crowd the way he always moved through a crowd at a county event, stopping to talk, to clap shoulders, to make the kind of comment that passed for wit in that context. He bought sodas for people he knew. He waved at the county assessor. He found the right moment to mention the 4440 to several different people, its horsepower figure, its price, its innovative features, the climate-controlled cab, the power shift transmission. He was performing the way he always performed, but the performance was so practiced and so embedded in his sense of himself that he would not have recognized it as performance. He would have called it being friendly. He would have called it civic engagement. At some point in the early afternoon, he noticed that people were coming down from the grandstands and walking toward the staging area to look at the competitors. This was normal at a pull of this size. What was less normal was that several of those people were specifically walking to look at Earl Maddox's Farmall standing in front of it, talking to each other in low voices. He watched this from 20 yards away with the particular alertness of a man whose sense of his own centrality has been momentarily disturbed. At 4:15 the open class was called. 15 tractors pulled into the competition area. The track was 300 feet of packed dirt straight and wide with the weighted sled sitting at the near end, connected to a cable and a scale system that measured how far each competitor could drag it before losing momentum. The sled worked by transferring its weight forward as it moved a mechanical progression that made each additional foot of distance exponentially harder to achieve. The physics of it were simple. The execution was not. The crowd in the grandstands numbered just over 2,000 at this point. The fair had drawn well that year. The August heat had not kept people home the way some years it did. The grandstands were full along their full length, and people were standing 3 deep along the infield fence. Earl drew the 8th starting position. Harlan drew 12th. The first 7 competitors ran their pulls. The distances ranged from 187 feet on the low end to 300 feet for the International 1466, which Gerald Burke had prepared with the rebuilt injection pump, and which earned a full pull and a roar from the crowd that could be heard in the parking lot. One of the case tractors also ran a full pull. The Massey Ferguson fell short at 264 feet, its modified engine not delivering what its owner had hoped. The crowd was engaged, enthusiastic, working through their programs and their conversations and their late afternoon sodas with the particular pleasure of watching something they understood and cared about. Then the announcer said Earl Maddox, Eldora, Iowa. 1961 Farmall 560. There was a murmur through the grandstands, not laughter exactly, more a kind of collective intake of breath, a shared moment of doubt or confusion, the sound a crowd makes when something unexpected appears that it has not yet decided how to process. A few people laughed, but most did not. Most simply looked. Earl climbed up onto the Farmall. He settled himself on the seat the way he settled himself on that seat every single morning of the farming year without ceremony, with the complete ease of long familiarity. He turned the key. The engine caught on the first revolution, and the sound it made when it caught was not the sound that most of the crowd expected. They expected the rough, reluctant idle of an old engine with worn tolerances and tired valves. They expected the mechanical resignation of a machine that had been worked too hard for too long. What they heard instead was a sound that was deep and steady and authoritative, a sound that was somehow larger than the machine it was coming from. A sound that made several people in the grandstands look at each other with an expression that asked silently whether they were hearing what they thought they were hearing. Earl let the engine warm for a minute. Then he pulled forward to the hook. The track judge gave him the signal. He eased the clutch out. The Farmall moved forward. The cable went taut. The sled began to move. For the first 100 feet it looked like what most people expected. A small, old, underpowered machine pulling a weighted sled working hard, making the most of its modest resources. People in the grandstands watched with the polite, slightly anticipatory attention of a crowd waiting for the inevitable short pull that would confirm their prior expectations. Some were already looking at their programs, calculating what came next. At 150 feet, people stopped looking at their programs. At 200 feet, a section of the grandstand on the south side went quiet in a way that had a quality to it. Not the quiet of disinterest, but the quiet of people who have stopped talking because they are now paying full attention. At 250 feet, people were standing up. The Farmall's engine was not making the sound of a machine at its limit. It was making the sound of a machine that has found its range and is working inside it with something to spare. The exhaust stack was shooting black smoke in the cadenced bursts that indicate an engine under load, but the rhythm of the smoke was steady and even, not the desperate, uneven firing of an engine about to quit. The rear tires were digging into the track, throwing arcs of displaced dirt out behind them, and the tractor was moving not fast, but moving with a consistency that was beginning to communicate something to the crowd that they had not anticipated communicating. At 275 feet, the sound from the grandstands had become something distinct and directionless. The sound of 2,000 people reacting to something simultaneously without having agreed to react. At 300 feet, the Farmall crossed the line. Full pull. What happened next in those grandstands was not orderly. It was not the measured, appreciative response of a crowd that had predicted what it was seeing. It was the eruption of people who have been surprised completely, who have seen something that contradicts what they were certain they understood, who are processing the gap between expectation and reality in the only way available to them in that moment, which is loudly and all at once. People were on their feet, people were pointing, people were turning to the person next to them and saying something the same thing, some variation of the same thing, which was an expression of disbelief made audible. Earl Maddox drove the Farmall back to the staging area. He shut the engine down. He climbed off the tractor. He walked to the water cooler and poured a cup of water and drank it standing up, the same way he had drunk water all afternoon. He did not look at the grandstands, he did not look at the scoreboard, he did not look at the other competitors. He looked at a spot on the ground in front of him, or at nothing in particular, which amounted to the same thing. He had known what the machine would do. He had known it for 8 years. He did not need confirmation from a scoreboard. Harlan Denton was standing 20 feet away when Earl returned to the staging area. He had come down from the grandstands at some point during the pull. He was standing very still. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who has just encountered information that his entire framework for understanding the world has no category for. It was the expression of a man who has not yet begun to adjust because the adjustment required is too large and too fast to begin in the moment. He was not smiling. This was notable in a way that several people in the staging area registered and remembered later because Harlan Denton was almost always smiling in public, the practiced, confident smile of a man who has decided that smiling is part of how power presents itself to the world. The absence of that smile was like the absence of a sound you have heard so consistently you have stopped registering it as a sound until it stops. He looked at Earl. He looked at the Farmall. He looked at the scoreboard where Earl's distance 300 feet full pull was posted next to the name Maddox, and then the announcer called his name. Harlan Denton, Eldora, Iowa, 1979 John Deere, 4440. The grandstands responded. It was genuine, the response, a recognition of the machine, if not of the man, because that John Deere was what most of the people there thought of when they thought of what a serious tractor looked like. It was green and clean and enormous, sitting on tires that were taller than most of the children in the crowd, radiating the particular authority of new machinery that has not yet been used hard enough to acquire any humility. But Harlan did not go to his machine yet. He turned and looked at Earl, And what he saw was a man standing with a paper cup of water looking at nothing, demonstrating in every line of his posture and every angle of his stillness the complete indifference of a man who already knows what the afternoon is going to bring. That was when Harlan Denton reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his money clip. He turned to the crowd. His voice when he found it was loud. It was the voice he used on the county board when he wanted a motion to carry. It was a voice practiced in the art of filling a room, filling a space, making itself the largest thing in the available air. He said $10,000. $10,000 says that machine does not make it halfway down the track in the finals. The staging area went quiet. The quiet spread outward into the crowd near the infield fence, and then upward into the lower sections of the grandstands as people turned to look and the information moved through the crowd, the way information always moves through crowds imperfectly and rapidly. Harlan held up the money. Bills. Cash. It was theatrical, and he knew it, and he did not care because this was what he did when the situation required recalibration. He made it large. He made it public. He made it something that was going to have to be resolved in front of witnesses, because witnesses were where he was most comfortable, where the weight of his presence and his money and his 30 years of accumulated authority in this county could do their proper work. Earl Maddox looked at Harlan Denton. He looked at the money, he looked at the grandstands, at the 2,000 people who were watching this unfold with the specific attention of people who understand that they are witnessing something that is going to be talked about. The kind of moment that a county stores in its collective memory and retrieves at diners and co-op meetings and church suppers for years afterward. He looked back at Harlan, and he said 4 words. I will take that. The crowd did not laugh. That was the thing that Harlan had not accounted for. He had expected the crowd to laugh with him, to validate the outrageousness of the bet by treating it as obvious, as inevitable as the kind of wager that a man of his resources and certainty makes, because the outcome is not in question. He had expected the laughter to do the work of establishing in front of everyone that what was happening here was a formality, that the Farmall was already beaten, that Earl Maddox was already embarrassed, that the only question was how far short of his expectations the old machine was going to fall. Instead, the crowd went still. Walt Pruitt, standing at the infield fence, did not laugh. He had made a loan payment the previous spring using money he had borrowed from his brother-in-law. He had sat across a desk from Harlan Denton 3 years ago at a county board meeting and listened to Harlan argue against a drought relief program that might have helped 6 families in the east part of the county argue against it with the particular confidence of a man for whom the abstraction of fiscal policy is more real than the specific suffering of neighbors. Walt did not laugh. The woman sitting in the 3rd row of the grandstands, whose father had sold 60 acres to Harlan Denton in 1971 for a price that was fair by the standards of that month, and was considerably less fair by the standards of any month afterward, did not laugh. The man 3 seats down from her, who had been at the same auction in 1975 where Harlan Denton had purchased a neighbor's equipment at prices that the neighbor described afterward as feeling like the ground was taken out from under him, did not laugh. There was in that moment a reckoning happening in the grandstands of the Hardin County Fair that had very little to do with tractors. There was a crowd of people who had spent years experiencing Harlan Denton as a fact of the landscape, as weather, as something you accommodated because it was too large and too permanent to argue with. And now they were watching a man in worn boots and a faded work shirt stand in a staging area next to a rusty machine and say 4 words that made the whole question suddenly open again. I will take that. Harlan looked at Earl. His jaw was set. His hand was still holding the money clip. Something moved across his face, a calculation, a reassessment, something that was not quite doubt but was adjacent to doubt, close enough that it had the same shape. Then it passed. He had spent 49 years being certain of himself. Certainty was not a habit you broke in a moment. He nodded. Done, he said. The two men looked at each other across the staging area for a moment, and in that moment something was established between them that had nothing to do with money and nothing to do with tractors and everything to do with what two men can know about each other in an instant when the situation strips away everything they have been using to avoid that knowledge. Then the announcer called Harlan's name again, and he turned and walked to his John Deere, and the grandstands began to find their voice again, and the afternoon light was coming in at a lower angle, now the shadows stretching east across the fairgrounds, and Earl Maddox was standing next to his machine with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the track. He had made his decision 3 weeks ago. He had known what he was doing when he walked up to Clara's table at 7:45 that morning and put his $25 on the desk. He had known what was inside the engine block of the machine that Harlan Denton had called junkyard scrap and offered $500 to take off his hands. He had known all of it. He had carried it for 8 years. This knowledge, the way you carry something that has weight, but that you have grown accustomed to, so accustomed that you no longer notice the carrying until the moment arrives when you are finally able to set it down. The moment had not arrived yet, but it was close now, very close. The finals were set for 5:30. The sun was getting lower. The heat was beginning to break, barely just the first suggestion of evening coming in from the north. The crowd had settled back into its seats, and the hum of the fairgrounds had returned the midway, and the food stands and the animals in the exhibition barns all contributing their particular frequencies to the August afternoon. Earl Maddox stood beside his Farmall 560 and waited. He had never been a man in a hurry. He was not about to start now. The finals began at 5:30 as promised, with the sun dropping toward the tree line to the west, and the shadows of the grandstands falling long and cool across the infield. The temperature had come down perhaps 4 degrees from the peak of the afternoon, which was not enough to call relief, but was enough to remind people that the day was moving, that the heat was not permanent, that the particular suspended quality of a hot Iowa August afternoon eventually resolves into something more bearable if you wait long enough. 8 tractors had made the cut from the opening round, both case machines from Grundy County, Gerald Burke's International 1466, which had posted its full pull early and drawn the loudest sustained response of the preliminary round. The modified Massey Ferguson, which had fallen short of its owner's hopes, but had pulled far enough to advance. 2 other machines from the field that had run solid distances without drama. Harlan Denton's John Deere 4440, which had run its preliminary pull with the smooth, confident authority of a machine that has not yet been asked to try, and Earl Maddox's Farmall 560, which had done what it had done and which was now sitting in the staging area with the same stillness it always had, giving nothing away. The finals added 2,000 pounds to the sled. This was standard for the Hardin County pull at this stage, a significant increment that separated the machines that had looked impressive in the preliminaries from the machines that had genuine depth. The physics of the sled were unforgiving in this way. A tractor could look dominant at the lighter weight and then discover when the additional load was applied that it had been operating near its ceiling all along without knowing it. The extra weight had a way of making the truth visible. The crowd in the grandstands had grown since the preliminary round. Word moves at a county fair the way it has always moved from person to person and mouth to ear, and the word that had moved through the Hardin County Fair in the late afternoon of August 18th, 1979, was that something unusual was happening at the tractor pull, something worth seeing, something that involved a rusty old machine and a very large bet, and an outcome that was not yet settled. By the time the finals were announced, people who had been at the Midway, people who had been looking at livestock in the exhibition barn, people who had been sitting in lawn chairs in the parking lot, eating corn on the cob, and not planning to attend the pull at all, had made their way to the grandstands. The count at the start of the finals was just over 2,000. The infield fence was thick with people standing. Earl sat on the Farmall and looked at the track. The track was 300 feet of packed dirt that had been worked and reworked over the course of the day by the traffic of machines and officials and the particular compaction that a weighted sled creates when it travels and stops and is reset and travels again. The surface in the finals would be different from the surface in the preliminaries, and experienced competitors accounted for this thought about where the best traction was likely to be, where the compaction was deepest, where the surface was likely to give way under hard load. Earl had been watching the track all afternoon. He had his own understanding of where it would hold and where it would not, the way he had an understanding of his own fields, the low spots where moisture pooled the sandy patches near the fence, row the hard ground near the old drainage tile that his father had laid in 1952. He had spent 17 years learning to read this machine. He had spent 44 years learning to read ground. These were the things he had brought to the starting line, and no amount of factory air conditioning or power shift transmission or $45,000 price tags changed the value of what he carried. The first four competitors ran their pulls. The distances were as follows. The first case tractor pulled 235 feet before the sled stopped its forward movement and the tractor's tires spun in place without gaining ground. The second case pulled 251 feet, a solid run that drew genuine appreciation from the crowd. Gerald Burke's International 1466, which had been the co-favorite going into the finals alongside Harlan's John Deere, pulled 247 feet, 4 feet short of its full pull in the preliminaries, the heavier sled having found the ceiling that the lighter weight had concealed. The Massey Ferguson pulled 268 feet, the best of the first four, drawing a response from the grandstands that acknowledged its owner's modified engine had found something useful after all. Then they called Earl's name. He heard it the way he heard most things at a distance from himself clearly, but without the kind of internal response that changes how you breathe or how you sit or how your hands feel on the wheel. He had been listening to his own name called at various points of significance throughout his life, and had never found a satisfactory reason to treat it as a signal to become someone other than himself. He eased the Farmall forward to the hook point. The track judge connected the chain. Earl gave the engine a moment listening to its note, feeling through the seat and the wheel the particular communication a machine makes when it is ready, the way a settled breathing sounds different from a held one. The flag came down. He brought the clutch out in the specific way he had developed over years of working this machine, hard, not dumping it, not feathering it excessively, finding the narrow window between those two approaches where the power transferred to the ground in the most efficient way the mechanical system allowed. The Farmall moved forward. The chain went taut in the first instant, and then the sled began its movement slower than in the preliminaries because the weight was different, because the physics were different, but moving steadily. At 100 feet, the sled was heavy in a way that translated through every component of the drivetrain as a constant increasing demand, a demand that communicated itself through the sound of the engine and the behavior of the rear tires, and the feeling in the seat that experienced operators know as the tractor talking, telling you what it is, experiencing telling you what it needs. Earl listened. He had been listening to this machine for 17 years. He heard things in its operation that no one else present could have heard, because no one else present had spent 17 years learning its vocabulary. At 150 feet, the tires on the Farmall were working harder. The track surface in this section of the pull had been compressed differently by the earlier machines, and the ground was giving slightly under load in a way that cost traction, the rear tires having to work through a brief spin before finding purchase again. Earl felt it before it happened the way you feel the beginning of a slide before the tires have actually broken loose, and he made the small, precise adjustments that 17 years of experience had given him access to, shifting his weight, modulating the throttle in increments, small enough that they would not have been visible from the grandstands, but were large enough to keep the machine working at its most efficient point. At 200 feet, the crowd was standing again. He could feel this without looking at them. There is a change in the ambient sound of a crowd when it comes to its feet, something that is more than volume, a frequency shift, a change in the quality of the noise that is distinguishable even over the sound of a working diesel engine and the mechanical protest of a sled being dragged across packed dirt. He did not look at the grandstands. He looked at the track ahead of him, and at the marks on the ground that indicated distance, and at the behavior of the machine underneath him, which was telling him things that required his full attention. At 250 feet, the sled was approaching the weight transfer point where the mechanical progression of the system made each additional foot of distance significantly harder than the one before it. This was where the pull was actually decided, not in the first 100 feet where momentum and initial power were the primary factors, but here in this narrow window where the sled was at its most demanding and the tractor was at its most committed, and the outcome was genuinely in question. Earl could hear the engine working at a register that was different from its lower load sound. A deeper, more urgent note, still rhythmic, but carrying more of itself into each revolution. He had heard this sound before many times in the fields when the discs were running through ground that had been too dry for too long, when the cultivator was fighting root systems that had gone deep after a summer with too little rain. The machine had been here before. It knew this territory. He knew it alongside the machine, the two of them working it together, the way they had always worked the hard ground together with patience and with purpose, and without the kind of desperation that wastes effort. At 275 feet, the tires began to spin. This was not the terminal spin, the spin that means the machine has reached its absolute limit and the sled has won. This was the transitional spin, the kind that happens when the ground surface shifts and the tires momentarily lose their bite before finding it again. The kind that an inexperienced operator or an operator who does not know his machine well enough might respond to wrongly, either by backing off the throttle too much and losing momentum, or by pushing through it at full power and burning the tires across the surface without progress. Earl did neither. He did what 17 years had taught him to do, which was to respond to what the machine was actually doing rather than to what he feared it might do. He made the adjustments that the moment required, precise and small and exactly calibrated to the specific behavior of this specific machine on this specific ground, and the tires found their purchase again, and the Farmall moved forward 280 feet, 283 feet, 287 feet. At 287 feet the sled stopped. The engine continued, the tires continued to turn, but the sled did not move, and after 5 seconds of that without change, the track judge raised his flag. 287 feet. Best distance of the finals. The grandstands made their noise. It was a different noise from the full pull in the preliminaries, not the pure explosive release of complete surprise, but something more complex, a sound that acknowledged that what was happening was real and sustained, and not the product of a lucky run or a favorable track surface or any of the other explanations that people reach for when they encounter something they did not expect and need to fit into a framework they already hold. 287 feet with 2,000 additional pounds on the sled was not luck. It was something else, and the crowd in the grandstands was beginning to understand, in the way that crowds understand things collectively and without full articulation, what that something else was. Earl drove the Farmall back to the staging area. He shut the engine down. He climbed off the tractor and walked to the water cooler and poured a cup of water and drank it standing up, the same as he had done every other time he had returned from the track that afternoon. He did not look at Harlan Denton. He did not need to. Harlan was standing near his John Deere with his arms folded and his jaw set, and the particular stillness of a man who is doing the internal arithmetic that the situation requires and not finding the result he expects. He had watched Earl's pull from the staging area with the full attention of a man who is for the first time in a long time genuinely uncertain. He had watched the Farmall work its way down the track at a distance, and with a consistency that his framework for understanding this machine did not account for. He had stood there and watched, and the number on the scoreboard had gone up, and it was now 287 feet, and it was his turn. He climbed into the John Deere. The cab door closed behind him with the solid engineered sound of a $45,000 machine built to specifications that accounted for things like cab door closure as an element of the ownership experience. Inside the cab, it was quieter than outside the sound dampening doing its designed work. The air conditioning had been running intermittently all afternoon to keep the interior comfortable, and the temperature inside the cab was noticeably lower than the August air outside it. Harlan settled into the seat, which had more adjustment options and more padding than the iron seat on the Farmall, and looked through the clean glass of the windshield at the track ahead. He was a man who had won this pull 3 years in a row. He was a man who had driven this machine for 5 months and understood its capabilities in the way that a man understands the capabilities of a machine he has owned for 5 months, which is to say he understood the numbers on the specification sheet and the way those numbers express themselves under normal working conditions, and he had extrapolated from that understanding a set of expectations about what this machine would do when asked to perform under competition conditions with an additional 2,000 pounds on the sled. He believed those expectations were correct. He had no reason to believe they were not correct. He had spent 49 years developing confidence in his own judgment, and his judgment told him that 130 horsepower from a turbocharged modern diesel engine was more than enough to beat 287 feet of track. The flag came down. The John Deere moved forward with the authority of a machine that has genuine power available and knows how to deliver it. The sound it made was different from the Farmall's sound, smoother, more refined, the sound of modern engineering as opposed to the older, rawer note of a machine from another era. The crowd responded to the sound of it the way crowds respond to the obvious manifestation of power, with a kind of reflexive recognition, a leaning forward. At 100 feet, the 4440 was pulling strongly. The sled was moving, the distance numbers were accumulating with the metronomic regularity of a machine working well inside its operating range. At 150 feet, it was still strong. At 200 feet, the crowd was on its feet for the second time in the finals. At 230 feet, something changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was not a mechanical failure or a catastrophic loss of traction. It was subtler than that, the kind of change that an experienced operator feels through the seat and the wheel before it manifests in any visible behavior of the machine. A slight shift in the way the power was meeting the ground, a change in the relationship between what the engine was providing and what the rear tires were able to convert into forward motion. The track surface in this section had been worked by 8 machines by this point in the afternoon, and it had given up something in those passages, some quality of compaction or composition, that had made it receptive to the kind of traction that wide, modern tires with aggressive lug patterns required. Harlan felt it. He responded the way he knew to respond, adjusting the throttle, checking the transmission position, doing the things that the operator's manual and 5 months of experience told him to do in this circumstance. The machine responded. The tires found purchase again, and the sled moved forward, and the distance numbers continued to accumulate. 250 feet, 260, 270. At 278 feet, the rear tires lost traction. Not transitionally, not in the brief recoverable way that had happened to Earl at 275 feet. This was a more complete loss, the tires spinning across the surface without finding the bite that would allow the sled to move the engine, delivering its power to the drivetrain, and the drivetrain delivering it to the tires, and the tires converting it into heat and noise against the packed dirt without translating any meaningful portion of it into forward motion. Harlan tried. He made the adjustments that were available to him. He shifted his weight, which is less effective in an air-conditioned cab than it is on an open seat because the cab itself does not transmit the operator's weight to the tractor's center of gravity in the same way. He modulated the throttle. He tried a brief back-and-forth motion that sometimes breaks a sled loose when the initial momentum has died. None of it worked. The sled did not move. 278 feet. 9 feet short of 287. The track judge raised his flag. In the grandstands, 2,000 people absorbed this information simultaneously, and the sound they made was not the sound of a crowd responding to a winner. It was the sound of a crowd responding to something more complicated than winning and losing, the sound of people processing an outcome that confirmed something they had perhaps felt but not articulated, that made visible something that had been operating below the surface of the afternoon and the day and the years preceding the day. Harlan Denton sat in his John Deere 4440 and looked at the track ahead of him through the clean glass of the windshield. The remaining 2 competitors ran their pulls. The first pulled 261 feet. The second pulled 274 feet. Neither reached 287. The scoreboard did not change at the top of the column. When the announcer read the final results, there was a clarity to the numbers that no amount of subsequent conversation or revision could alter. Earl Maddox, Eldora, Iowa, 1961, Farmall 560,287 feet. First place, Harlan Denton, Eldora, Iowa, 1979. John Deere 4,440,278 feet. Second place, 9 feet. That was the distance between them. 9 feet of packed Iowa dirt on a hot August afternoon in front of 2,000 witnesses. The trophy was a thing that had been made by a local fabricator, sheet metal and a wooden base with a small engraved plate, the kind of trophy that looks exactly like what it is, which is the product of a county fair budget and a local craftsman doing his best with available materials. Earl accepted it from the fair committee chairman with the same expression he had worn all afternoon, which was no particular expression at all, just the face of a man receiving something that he had come to receive, and that required no performance on his part. Then he walked across the staging area to where Harlan Denton was standing. Harlan had not left. This was worth noting. He had every social mechanism available to him that would have allowed him to leave to find somewhere else to be while the results were announced, to return after the crowd had dispersed and settle the matter in private. He had not used any of them. He was standing next to his John Deere with his arms at his sides and his jaw set and that expression on his face that had replaced the smile sometime during Earl's preliminary pull and had not departed since. Earl stopped in front of him. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at Harlan for a moment in the way that a man looks at another man when he wants to be certain that what he is about to say is going to land in the right place, that the moment is correctly constituted for the communication he intends. Then he said, "I will take that 10,000 now." It was quiet enough in the immediate vicinity at that moment that several people standing within 20 feet heard it clearly. And those several people told several other people, and within a relatively short time the story of those 6 words and what came after them was part of the county's permanent record. Harlan looked at Earl. His jaw tightened. Something moved across his face. Several things moved across his face in rapid succession. Anger and calculation, and something that might have been the earliest, least welcome signal of shame, the kind that arrives before you are ready for it and does not care whether you are ready. He looked at the people around them, at the grandstands above them, at the witnesses who had been witnesses all afternoon and were witnesses still. He reached into his jacket and took out his checkbook. He wrote a check for $10,000. He handed it to Earl without looking at him. Earl took the check. He looked at it briefly the way you look at something to confirm it says what you expect it to say. Then he folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket. He nodded once. He walked back to the Farmall. He did not smile. He did not speak to anyone on the way back to the staging area. He did not look at the grandstands where people were talking and pointing and processing the afternoon in the collective way that crowds process the afternoons they are going to talk about for years. He walked back to his machine and he started the engine and he drove it out of the fairgrounds down the county road that led back toward his farm at the same pace he drove everywhere, which was not slow and was not fast, and was exactly the pace of a man who knows where he is going and has no interest in performing the knowing. The check for $10,000 sat in his shirt pocket the whole way home. When he got back to the farm, he parked the Farmall in the barn. He stood in the barn for a moment with the evening light coming through the east-facing window at the particular angle it came through at that hour in August, falling across the concrete floor and the side of the tractor in the long golden way that evening light in Iowa falls in August, which is one of the things about Iowa in August that People who have lived there all their lives take for granted, and people who have never lived there cannot quite believe when they first see it. He placed his hand on the engine block. It was warm from the afternoon's work. He said nothing. He simply stood there with his hand against the metal for a moment, and then he nodded once and he went inside. The $10,000 check went into the savings account at the Hardin County Bank on Monday morning without ceremony. Earl gave the teller the deposit slip and the check and received his receipt and put the receipt in his shirt pocket and drove home. That was the whole transaction. He did not celebrate. He did not tell anyone where the money had come from, though everyone in the county already knew, or knew within the week, because that is how counties work, and that is how stories work, in places where people have known each other long enough to care about each other's business. The money sat in the account. Earl did not spend it. He was not saving it for anything specific. He simply could not identify any purpose for which it seemed appropriate to use it. It did not feel to him like money he had earned in the ordinary sense. It felt like something else, like a marker for a lesson that had not yet concluded, like the physical form of a truth that still had distance to travel before it arrived at its destination. He went back to farming. He cut his corn in September. He did his fall tillage. He serviced the farmall and the rest of his equipment. When the season ended the way he always did, methodically and without shortcuts, because shortcuts in equipment maintenance are a form of borrowing against the future that he had no interest in. In October, he drove into Eldora on Saturday morning as he always did, and he sat at the counter at Patton's Diner for his 1 cup of coffee, and the talk at the counter was what the talk at the counter in Hardin County in October of 1979 was, which included, among other things, the news that Harlan Denton had purchased 400 additional acres of farmland in the eastern part of the county. The price, according to the talk at the counter, was $2,600 per acre. The financing was entirely through the bank. The transaction had closed the previous week. Earl listened to this information the way he listened to most information, which is to say completely and without visible reaction. He finished his coffee. He paid his bill. He drove home, but he sat in the kitchen for a long time after he got back. He sat at the same table where he had sat in the winter of 1971 and processed the information about his farmall where he had sat in 1965 after his father's funeral and taken stock of what he had and what it required of him. He sat at this table the way men sit at the tables where the significant thinking of their lives gets done with both hands flat on the surface and his eyes on something that was not in the room. Harlan Denton had just done the thing that Earl had feared he might do. He had responded to the loss, to the humiliation, to the afternoon at the county fair that had stripped something from him in front of 2,000 people, not by accounting for it. Honestly, not by asking himself what it meant or what it revealed, but by doubling down on the very thing that had gotten him into trouble in the first place. He had gone out and bought more land. He had gone further into debt. He had made himself larger on paper in the weeks after being made smaller in public because that was the only response available to a man whose entire sense of himself was constructed out of visible accumulation. Earl understood what this meant. He had grown up in Hardin County. He knew something about the mathematics of farming and about the economics of land purchased at the peak of a market with borrowed money at the interest rates that were prevailing in the autumn of 1979. He knew that those interest rates were not stable. He knew that land values had been running ahead of any reasonable projection of agricultural productivity, and that markets that run ahead of fundamentals eventually return to them. and that the return journey is not comfortable for people who have borrowed heavily against the inflated numbers. He knew that what Harlan Denton had done in October of 1979 was not a demonstration of confidence. It was a demonstration of fear wearing the costume of confidence, which is the most dangerous kind because the man wearing it cannot tell the difference. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time, then he went to bed. The following year, 1980, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates in earnest. By the spring of 1981, the prime rate had reached nearly 20%, a number that belonged in a history of crisis rather than in the present tense of people's daily financial lives. But there it was, present and actual, and with immediate consequences for anyone who had borrowed at variable rates or who was carrying debt that needed to be serviced out of farm income that was itself under pressure from declining commodity prices and rising input costs. The farm crisis did not arrive all at once. It moved the way a flood moves in a flat landscape, slowly at first, then faster than anyone expected, the water finding every low point and filling it before moving to the next. Each individual farm's difficulty connected to the general difficulty, the way individual drops of water are connected to a flood. Farmers who had borrowed to expand in the late 1970s, who had bought land at the prices that a good market and cheap money had inflated to levels that the underlying productivity of that land could not actually support, found themselves in a position that got more difficult each quarter as the interest compounded and the land values declined and the grain prices moved in the wrong direction. Harlan Denton's operation was not uniquely exposed to this dynamic. There were farms across Iowa and Illinois and Indiana and the rest of the Corn Belt in the same position or worse positions. But his exposure was significant. He had borrowed heavily for the 400 acres in October of 1979, on top of existing debt from equipment purchases and improvements and the general expansion of an operation that had always required more investment than it generated because its owner's definition of success included visible scale rather than invisible efficiency. By 1982, according to what circulated at the diner counter and at the co-op and at the church meetings that Earl attended infrequently, but did attend, Harlan Denton owed the bank in the neighborhood of $800,000. His collateral, the land itself, had declined in value to perhaps half of what he had carried it at when the loans were made. The bank was not comfortable. The bank's discomfort expressed itself in the way banks express discomfort in letters and in telephone calls and in meetings with officers who used careful language that communicated clearly, if you were listening, that the institution's patience was not indefinite. Harlan stopped going to the diner. He stopped attending the county board meetings that he had attended for 15 years. He stopped appearing at the co-op. The plaques on the wall of the fellowship hall with his name on them acquired the quality that plaques acquire when the person named on them is no longer present to give them current meaning. People noticed the absence. They talked about it in the way that people talk about the absence of someone who has been a large presence, with a mixture of reactions that is not entirely uncomplicated. Earl noticed the absence too. He noticed it not with satisfaction and not with sorrow, but with the particular attention of a man who has been watching a situation develop for several years and recognizes the stage it has entered. He did not discuss what he noticed. He went about his farming. He maintained his equipment, He sat at the counter at Patton's Diner on Saturday mornings and drank his 1 cup of coffee and listened to what was being said and said very little himself. The $10,000 in the savings account at the Hardin County Bank continued to sit there. In the fall of 1984, the letters from the bank to the Denton farm became public knowledge in the way that such things become public knowledge in small counties, not through any official disclosure, but through the accumulated awareness of people who work in banks and who have relatives who work in banks and who live in a community where the financial distress of a major landowner has implications that make it everyone's business, whether or not it is officially anyone's business. The foreclosure proceedings were filed in January of 1985. The auction was scheduled for March 15th of that year. Earl read about the auction in the county paper on a Thursday afternoon in early March. He sat at the kitchen table with the paper open in front of him and read the legal notice twice. The paper gave the date and the time and the legal description of the property and the name of the attorney handling the proceeding and the name of the lending institution. He put the paper down. He thought about his father burning the loan note in the kitchen stove in February of 1950. He thought about the way his father had looked at him from across the room in the firelight, not with triumph, but with something quieter and more durable than triumph. His father had never explained what he was feeling in that moment. He had not needed to. Some things communicate themselves through the quality of a man's stillness, through the way he holds himself when the thing he has worked toward has arrived. Earl thought about Harlan Denton's grandfather buying 2,200 acres of Hardin County land in the decades when buying land in that way was possible for a man with capital and a willingness to acquire it from men who needed money more than they needed ground. He thought about the way that land passed from generation to generation and what it carried with it. Not just the physical ground, but the history of how it had changed hands, the record of every transaction that had brought it to its current owner, the weight of all that accumulation and all that displacement. He thought about a staging area in August, about a rusty machine that most of the county had already decided was a piece of junk, about 4 words spoken in front of 2,000 people. He thought about what he actually wanted, not what he wanted to have, what he wanted to have accomplished when the accounting was complete, when the record was closed. He sat at the table for a long time. Then he got up, put on his jacket, and went to the barn. He stood with his hand on the engine block of the Farmall 560. The metal was cool. The barn was quiet in the way barns are quiet in the early Iowa spring. That particular quiet that has winter still in it, the cold and the bare fields and the bare trees, but that has also the first very faint quality of something approaching the imperceptible tipping of the season toward what comes next. He had made up his mind before he put his hand on the engine block, but the gesture was something he did anyway, had always done the way you confirm with the body what the mind has already decided. 3 days before the auction on a cold Monday morning in March of 1985, Earl Maddox backed his truck down the long driveway of his farm, turned out onto the county road, and drove toward the Denton place. The drive took 11 minutes. He had made it before in the opposite direction, passing the Denton property on his way to Eldora, watching the big house and the big equipment sheds and the rows of machinery that Harlan had accumulated over the years, the physical expression of a life organized around visible scale. He had driven past it many times without stopping. He had never had a reason to stop. He had one now. He turned into the Denton driveway. The gravel under his tires made a sound that was different from the gravel on his own drive, a difference too subtle to name, but real enough to notice if you were the kind of man who noticed such things, which Earl was. He drove up to the house and parked next to the equipment shed and sat in the truck for a moment, his hands on the wheel, looking at the house. It was a large house, white with dark trim, 2 stories with a porch that ran the full width of the front and a detached garage to the north side. It was a house that had been built to express something the way certain houses are built, not simply to shelter the people inside them, but to communicate to the people outside them the standing of the family within. The paint was peeling slightly at the eaves. The porch had a board loose near the steps that had been loose for what looked like more than one winter. These were the details of a house that had been deferred from maintenance, not badly, not catastrophically, but noticeably in the way that maintenance gets deferred when the money and the attention that would normally go to it are going somewhere else. He got out of the truck, he walked to the front door and knocked. Norma Denton answered. She was a tall woman with gray hair that had gone fully gray in the years since Earl had last seen her at close range, which had been at the county fair on the afternoon of August 18th, 1979, when she had been sitting in the grandstands and watching what was happening on the track, with an expression that Earl, who had been on the track and not in the grandstands, had not seen but could now imagine. She was wearing a house dress and an apron, and she had the eyes of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time without being able to set it down. When she saw Earl, she stopped. He said, "I would like to speak with Harlan if he is available, just for a few minutes." She looked at him. She looked at his truck. She looked back at him. There was something complicated in that look, something that included more than one kind of recognition. The recognition of who he was, and the recognition of why he might be here, and the recognition of all the space between those two things. She said, "Come in." The inside of the house was warm and smelled of coffee and something baked, and underneath both of those things, the particular smell of a house that has been lived in by people under stress, a smell that is not unclean, but that carries the quality of accumulated tension of rooms that have held difficult conversations. She led him to the living room and left him there. He heard her on the stairs, and then the sound of a door, and then quiet. He stood in the living room with his cap in his hands and looked at the room. There were photographs on the mantelpiece. A wedding photograph, a family photograph with children at various ages, a photograph of a man on a tractor that Earl recognized as a much younger Harlan. The tractor, an older model, something from the late 1950s. The man in the photograph squinting into the sun with an expression that had not yet organized itself around the performance of certainty, an expression that was simply a young man's expression, open and unguarded in the way that young men's faces are, before the years teach them what to protect. Harlan came into the room. He had aged more than Earl had expected. The gray at his temples had gone all the way through by now, his hair entirely silver, and his face had the particular lines of a man who has spent several years not sleeping well. He was still large, still carried himself with the residual physical confidence of a man who had been strong all his adult life, but something in the quality of his presence had changed, had diminished in the specific way that sustained pressure diminishes a thing, not breaking it, but pressing it into a smaller version of itself. He stopped when he saw Earl. He said, "I figured it would be you or the bank." He paused. "I already know what the bank wants. Earl said I am not here as the bank." Harlan looked at him. That old calculation was still there, the reflexive assessment that he applied to every situation, the attempt to understand what was in front of him in terms of advantage and disadvantage of position. But underneath it was something that Earl had not seen on Harlan Denton's face before. The look of a man who has run out of the resources he has always used to manage the world and does not yet know what comes next. Earl said, "Sit down if you want. I have something to say, and it will take a minute." Harlan sat. Earl sat across from him, the same distance that a kitchen table creates between two men who are going to talk honestly about something that matters. He held his cap in both hands and looked at Harlan and said what he had come to say. He said that he understood the situation with the bank. He said that he had spoken to an officer at the Hardin County Bank the previous week and had a general understanding of the numbers involved. He said that he had a proposition and that Harlan could take it or leave it, but that he would need an answer by the following morning, because the proposition would not improve with time, and Earl had other things he could do with both the morning and the money. He said he would pay off the outstanding loan balance, which the bank had confirmed was in the neighborhood of $380,000. In exchange, Harlan would deed him 600 acres, specifically the original Denton family land, the ground that Harlan's grandfather had accumulated in the early decades of the century, the ground that had been in the family the longest. Harlan would retain 1,600 acres, including the home place, the equipment, and the buildings. He said that is enough ground to run a real operation if you run it right. If you stop trying to be the biggest and start trying to be the best, 1,600 acres in this county is a living. Harlan stared at him. He was silent for a long time, the silence of a man doing arithmetic that does not come out to any number he expected. He said, "Why?" Earl looked at him. He looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece, the young man squinting into the sun on a tractor before the performance of certainty had organized itself. He said, "Because that day at the fair was not about winning, it was never about the money. It was about the fact that you looked at me and you looked at that machine and you decided that what you saw was the whole of what was there. You decided that a man who did not have what you had was less than what you were. I wanted you to see that you were wrong." He paused. "I have seen it," he said. "We are done with that. What I do not want, what I did not come for that morning at the fair, and what I am not here for today, is to watch you lose the land your family built. That is not what the lesson was supposed to cost." Harlan was quiet for a long time. The house was quiet around them. Outside, through the window, the early March landscape of Hardin County was gray and brown and bare, the fields flat and wide and empty, the way Iowa fields are empty in March before the season turns, carrying the memory of last year's crop and the promise of next year's in the same neutral, patient ground. Harlan said, "You will need an answer by tomorrow morning." Earl said, "That is correct." He stood up. He put his cap back on his head. He looked at Harlan once more, the long, direct look of a man who has nothing to perform and no interest in performing it. Then he walked out through the living room and through the front door and down the porch steps, the loose board giving slightly under his weight, and he got into his truck and drove back down the Denton driveway and turned onto the county road and went home. He made his dinner, he read for an hour, he went to bed. In the morning before he went to the barn to start his day, the telephone rang. The telephone rang at 6:40 in the morning, which was late by Earl Maddox's standards. He had already been to the barn. He had already placed his hand on the engine block of the Farmall and stood in the early March quiet and listened to the barn settle around him in the cold. He had already made his coffee and eaten his breakfast and washed his one plate and his one cup. and set them in the drying rack beside the sink. When the telephone rang, he was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the fields, which were gray and bare and flat, in the way that Hardin County fields are flat in early March, carrying no particular promise, yet simply waiting with the patience of ground that has been through enough seasons to know that the season always turns. He picked up the receiver on the third ring. Harlan said yes. That was the whole of it. One word. Earl said he would be at the bank at 9. Harlan said he would be there. Earl hung up the telephone and stood in the kitchen for a moment with his hand still resting on the receiver, not thinking about anything in particular, simply present in the moment, the way he was present in most moments, fully and without agitation. Then he went to get his coat. The closing at the Hardin County Bank took 2 hours and 20 minutes. There was an attorney present on Harlan's side, a man named Grover Pell, who had an office above the hardware store in Eldora, and who had been handling the Denton family's legal work for 15 years. There was a loan officer from the bank named Raymond Schiff, who had the manner of a man who has presided over a great many difficult transactions and has learned to bring to them a professional neutrality that is not unkindness, but is also not warmth. Earl had no attorney. He had reviewed the documents himself the night before reading them at the kitchen table with the methodical attention he brought to any task that mattered, and he had found them to be what Raymond Schiff had told him they would be, which was straightforward. $380,000 moved from Earl's account to the bank's account. 600 acres of Hardin County farmland, the original Denton family ground, moved from Harlan Denton's name to Earl Maddox's name. The paperwork for both transactions was signed and witnessed and notarized and filed, and when it was done, Raymond Schiff gathered the documents into a folder and said that concluded the matter, which was the most accurate thing anyone had said all morning. Harlan signed his name to each document without speaking. His hand was steady. His face was the face of a man who has made a decision that cost him something real, and who has decided in the particular way that certain men decide things. That if the decision is made, then it is made, and what is behind it is behind it, and what remains is what remains, and you face what remains with whatever you have left. Earl had not expected anything dramatic from Harlan at the closing table, and he did not receive anything dramatic. What he received was the quiet dignity of a man who understood what had happened and was bearing it without performance, which was more than Earl had expected, and more than most people who knew Harlan Denton would have predicted. When they walked out of the bank into the pale March sunlight, Harlan stopped on the sidewalk. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the street, at the hardware store and the diner and the grain elevator visible at the end of the block, and the flat, wide Iowa sky above all of it. He said, "I will need to learn some things about running 1,600 acres the right way, on a budget that is actually a budget." Earl looked at him. He said, "That is a learnable set of things." Harlan nodded. He said, "I suppose it is." They parted on the sidewalk without ceremony. Earl walked to his truck. Harlan walked to his. There was nothing further to say at that moment, and both men understood this, and neither of them said it. The auction that had been scheduled for March 15th was canceled. The notice appeared in the county paper the following week in the space where the auction advertisement had been, a brief legal notice of cancellation that contained no explanation and required none. People who read it understood what it meant. people who did not read it learned within a few days from people who had, because that is how information travels in a place where people have been paying attention to each other's circumstances for generations. The story of what Earl Maddox had done circulated through Hardin County that spring, with the particular movement of a story that contains something people need to think about, something that does not resolve easily into a simple category of meaning. Some people found it straightforwardly admirable, the act of a decent man who had made his point, and then chose generosity over continued advantage. Some people found it more complicated than that, finding in it a transaction with layers that were not fully visible, wondering what Earl Maddox had bought beyond the 600 acres of ground. Some people, fewer in number, but present in any community, found it suspicious in ways they could not fully articulate, defaulting to the assumption that a man who does something generous in public must have a reason for doing it in public that the generosity itself does not account for. Earl did not engage with any of these interpretations. He had not done what he did for the county's assessment of it. He had done it because it was what the situation called for by his own reckoning, which was the only reckoning he consulted in matters of this kind. He planted his corn that spring. He worked his fields. He added the 600 acres of Denton ground to his rotation and began the process of understanding it, the way he understood his own ground field by field, watching how water moved across it, noting where the soil changed, character, learning its drainage and its fertility and its particular relationship to the weather patterns of that part of the county. This was work that took years to do properly, and he began it without impatience, the way he began everything, with the understanding that the work itself was the point, and that the results would arrive in their own time. In the first summer after the closing, he drove past the Denton place several times a week on his way to and from the 600 acres he had acquired, and occasionally he saw Harlan in the fields. The John Deere 444 was gone by June of that year, sold to a farmer in Marshall County for a price that reflected the market's assessment of used equipment in a period of agricultural distress. In its place was an older International, a model from the early 1970s, practical and functional and unglamorous in every dimension. Earl saw Harlan driving it one afternoon from a distance and noted the sight without reaction, the way he noted most things, filing it into his understanding of how the situation was developing without assigning it more weight than it carried. By the second summer, something had changed about the way Harlan moved through his own land. It was subtle enough that most people would not have noticed it or would not have had the context to interpret it correctly if they had noticed it. Earl noticed it because he had been watching Harlan Denton for years, with the careful attention he applied to problems that required sustained observation before they became fully legible. What he saw was a man who was beginning to farm rather than perform farming, a man who was beginning to be interested in the work itself rather than in what the work signified about him. The equipment shed at the Denton place began to look different. The equipment that remained after the 444 and several other machines had been sold was being maintained with an attention it had not previously received. The hydraulic lines that had been weeping oil on the loader tractor were replaced. The disc that had been stored outside under a tarpaulin was moved inside. These were not dramatic changes. They were the kind of changes that a man makes when he begins to take seriously the things in front of him, rather than the image he is projecting to the world behind him. In the fall of 1986, Harlan Denton drove to Earl's farm and parked in the yard, and came to the door and asked if Earl could show him how to rebuild the injection pump on the old International, which was losing power in a way that suggested the pump was worn beyond its useful life, but which Harlan could not afford to take to the dealer for a professional rebuild. Earl looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Come around to the barn." They spent most of that Saturday afternoon in Earl's barn with the International's injection pump on the workbench, Earl explaining what he was looking at and what it meant and what the correct response to each condition was. Harlan asking questions that were genuine questions, the questions of a man who wants to understand what he is learning rather than to perform the understanding of it. Earl answered each question with the same directness and completeness he brought to any explanation that someone was actually interested in receiving. When the pump was rebuilt and reinstalled and the engine was running cleanly again, Harlan wiped his hands on the shop rag and looked at the engine for a long moment. He said, "I spent 40 years buying new things instead of learning how the old things worked." Earl said most people do. Harlan said it is an expensive way to operate. Earl said it is. That was the substance of it. They did not have the conversation that some part of Harlan might have expected or hoped for, the conversation that cleared the air and addressed the history and arrived at something that could be called reconciliation, in the explicit verbal sense that people sometimes expect reconciliation to take. Earl was not interested in that conversation. He did not have it because he did not need it, because the afternoon in the barn had said everything that the afternoon in the barn needed to say without either man naming what was being said. This was how it went between them in the years that followed. They were not friends in the way that men who share their interior lives are friends. They were not close in any way that a person watching from outside would have characterized as warmth, but they became something that was in certain ways more durable than warmth, which is the relationship of two men who have been through something real together and who have arrived without discussion at a mutual respect that does not require maintenance because it is not based on feeling but on something closer to fact. When Earl was putting up hay in July and his baler broke down in the north field, Harlan brought his equipment over without being asked and finished the field. When Harlan's combine was throwing grain in the fall of 1988, Earl drove over and spent a morning with him finding the source of the problem and correcting it. These exchanges were not tracked. They were not acknowledged beyond the brief functional conversation of men working a problem together. They were simply what neighbors do when they have decided, in whatever way neighbors decide such things, that they are genuinely neighbors rather than merely people who live in proximity to each other. Norma Denton, who had watched her husband change over the years after the closing, with the particular attention of a woman who has been watching a man for a long time and knows the difference between surface change and genuine change, said something to her neighbor at a church supper in 1989 that was repeated afterward, not because it was dramatic, but because it was accurate. She said that she did not know what Earl Maddox had done to Harlan exactly, but that it was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and that she was grateful for it even though she did not fully understand it. The years moved the way years move in that part of Iowa, with the rhythm of the seasons and the rhythm of the work and the rhythm of the county fair each August, where the tractor pull continued to be contested and where Earl Maddox's name and the name of his Farmall 560 had achieved a permanent if informal status in the local understanding of what had happened there in 1979. The story was told at the diner and at the co-op and at the church suppers, growing slightly in the telling, the way local stories always grow, some details sharpening and others softening, the essential shape of it remaining intact, because the essential shape of it was too clear and too complete to be significantly distorted. People who had been in the grandstands that afternoon told it to their children. Their children told it to their children. The story acquired the quality of a parable, which is what happens to certain true stories when they contain something that people need to keep returning to, something they have not finished extracting meaning from. Earl, when the story was told in his presence, which happened occasionally at the diner counter or at the feed store, did not correct it or embellish it or comment on it beyond a brief acknowledgement that, yes, that had happened, and then redirecting the conversation to whatever else was available to redirect it to. He was not modest about it in the self-deprecating way that some men perform modesty. He simply did not find his own history as interesting as the people around him found it, which is a characteristic of men who are more engaged with what is in front of them than with what is behind them. The Farmall 560 continued to work. This was perhaps the most straightforward fact of those years. The machine that had been called Junkyard Scrap on an August afternoon in 1979 continued in the years that followed to do the work it was asked to do with the same reliability it had demonstrated across the decades of Earl's ownership. It required the maintenance that every machine requires. It required parts that became progressively harder to find as the years advanced and the machine aged beyond the period when dealer stocks of its components were routinely available. Earl found the parts he needed through the network of contacts that long-term operators of older equipment developed, the salvage yards and the retired mechanics and the other farmers who had run the same machines and had kept the surplus inventory they had accumulated. He never considered replacing it. The question did not seriously arise for him, not because he was sentimental about it, or not only because of that, but because the machine worked, and working machines are not replaced by men who understand the difference between appearance and function. In the spring of 1994, Harlan Denton was 64 years old. He had been farming his reduced operation for 9 years by then, and he had done it in the way that Earl had told him was possible, carefully and without the overhead of the previous era, with older equipment and without borrowed money, and with the particular concentration of a man who has learned later than he would have preferred what the actual essentials of his work are. He had not become a different person. He was still Harlan Denton, still a man with a strong jaw and a carrying voice, and the residual confidence of someone who had been large in the world. But the shape of his largeness had changed. It was less about acreage and equipment and more about the knowledge he had accumulated in the years of doing the work seriously rather than performing it. On a Thursday morning in June of 1994, Earl was driving the county road that ran between his home place and the 600 acres he had bought from Harlan 9 years earlier. It was a route he drove several times a week during the growing season, and he drove it with the automatic attention that familiar routes acquire, present enough to notice anything that required noticing, relaxed enough not to treat it as a task. He noticed the combine. It was Harlan's combine, a machine that Earl recognized from a distance by its configuration and its color, sitting stopped in the middle of Harlan's north cornfield at an angle that was not the angle of a machine that had been parked deliberately. It was the angle of a machine that had stopped in the middle of work, which combines do for various reasons, mechanical and otherwise. Earl pulled his truck to the side of the road and got out and stood on the running board and looked at the field. The combine had not moved. The surrounding corn was tall and thick and green in the June heat, and he could not see into the field from the road. He drove to Harlan's field entrance and went in. He found Harlan 20 yards from the combine, lying on his back between the rows of corn with one arm at his side and one arm across his chest, and his eyes open, looking at the sky above the corn, with the particular unfocused attention of a man who is not fully present in the place where his body is. Earl got out of the truck and went to him. Harlan was conscious. He was breathing in a way that was effortful and irregular and that communicated immediately what was happening, the way certain physical symptoms communicate their cause without requiring interpretation. His face was the color of old ash. There was sweat on his forehead and on his neck, despite the fact that he had been doing no particular physical work at the moment the event had taken him. Earl knelt beside him in the dirt between the corn rows and said his name. Harlan looked at him. His eyes found Earl's face with the slow, deliberate movement of a man marshalling what is available to him. He said something that was very quiet and that Earl leaned down to hear. What he said was, "I figured you would find me eventually." Earl said, "Do not talk." He put his hand on Harlan's shoulder briefly, the kind of contact that communicates steadiness without making any promises the situation cannot support. Then he stood and went to his truck and drove to the road at a speed that was appropriate to the urgency, and went to the nearest farmhouse and knocked on the door and asked to use the telephone. He called for the ambulance. Then he drove back to the field and went in and sat beside Harlan in the dirt between the corn rows and waited. The ambulance came in 14 minutes. In those 14 minutes, Earl talked to Harlan not constantly, not in the performed way that people sometimes talk to someone in distress, filling the silence with reassurance that serves the talker more than the listener, but intermittently and quietly saying practical things, the kind of things that give a man something to hold on to without requiring anything from him. He said the ambulance was coming. He said the field would wait. He said Harlan County Medical Center had a good cardiac unit, that he knew this because Walt Pruitt had been there the previous year and had done well. He said, "You are going to be all right." This last thing he said not because he was certain of it, but because it was the right thing to say to a man lying in a cornfield in June who needed something to hold on to while the sirens were still distant. Harlan survived. He was in the hospital for 11 days and in a rehabilitation facility for 3 weeks after that. The cardiologist was direct with him in the way that cardiologists are direct with 64-year-old men who have had significant cardiac events, laying out the parameters of what was possible going forward and what was not. Farming at the scale Harlan had been doing it was not possible. Not the physical farming, the climbing in and out of equipment, the long days in the heat, the sustained exertion that the body requires of a man running a crop operation. The cardiologist did not say this to be harsh. He said it because it was true, and because a man who had once lost most of what he had by refusing to hear true things being said to him deserved to have the true things said clearly. Harlan heard it. He lay in the hospital bed and he heard it with the same quiet steadiness he had brought to the closing table at the Hardin County Bank 9 years earlier. Colt came. He was in his mid-30s by then, living in Ames, where he worked for an engineering firm, married with 2 children, whose photographs sat on the nightstand in Harlan's hospital room, and who called their grandfather on the phone and said things that children say when they have been told an adult they love is in the hospital, things that were simple and unfiltered, and that meant more than the more sophisticated things the adults around Harlan were saying. Colt had his father's jaw and his father's frame, and a quality of directness that Earl, when he met him briefly in the hospital parking lot the second week of Harlan's stay, recognized as something that had perhaps come from watching his father lose everything that directness avoids, and then rebuild on the other side of that loss. Colt shook Earl's hand. He said he had heard about what Earl had done in 1985. He said he did not know what to think about it exactly, even all these years later. He said he thought it was probably more than his father deserved at the time, and then he said that his father had probably become someone who deserved it by now, and that he was not sure which of those things was more true. Earl said that they were both true, and that was all right. Colt looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. In the fall of 1994, 4 months after the cardiac event in the cornfield, Harlan Denton asked Earl Maddox to buy the remaining 1,600 acres. He made this request in person, driving to Earl's farm on a September afternoon when the corn was dry and the air had the particular quality of Iowa September air, cool and clear and carrying the smell of harvest beginning. He sat in Earl's kitchen at the kitchen table where Earl had sat in the winter of 1971 reading about his farmall, and in the early spring of 1985 reading the foreclosure notice in the county paper. It was the same table. The linoleum around it had been replaced once in the intervening years, and the chairs had changed, but the table itself was original, a piece of furniture that had outlasted many of the things it had witnessed. Harlan said, "I cannot farm it anymore. Not properly. Colt is in Ames. He has his life there. He is not coming back to work the ground. Norma and I want to stay in the house. That is all we want, but the ground needs someone who will work it right." Earl said, "I know that." Harlan said I could sell it in parcels. There are buyers. He paused. But if I sell it in parcels, it gets split up and it stays split up. 3 generations of my family put that land together. He stopped. He looked at the table. I am not a man who likes asking for things. You know that. Earl said, "I know that." Harlan said, "I am asking." Earl looked at him across the table. He looked at the man who had walked around his farmall at the county fair and kicked the tires and offered $500 for junk and announced a $10,000 bet to the grandstands and written the check with his jaw set and his hand steady and his pride fully visible in every line of his posture. He looked at the man who had signed the papers at the closing table 9 years later, with that same steadiness, stripped of the pride but not of the dignity, which is a distinction that matters. He looked at the man who had spent 9 years learning how to farm rather than how to perform farming, who had rebuilt an injection pump in Earl's barn on a Saturday afternoon and said a true thing about what those years had cost him. He said, "I will buy it. Fair market price, acre for acre." Harlan said, "I did not expect a discount." Earl said, "I know you did not." Harlan said, "And I would not have taken one." Earl said, "I know that too." The transaction closed in October of 1994 at a price that represented the current market value of the land without adjustment in either direction. No premium and no reduction, which was the only price that either man's understanding of the situation permitted. Earl paid what the land was worth. Harlan received what the land was worth. The paperwork was straightforward and was handled by the same attorney who had represented Harlan at the 1985 closing, Grover Pell, who was now in his late 60s and who conducted the transaction with the professional equanimity of a man who has seen enough of Hardin County's history to be unsurprised by any of its turns. When the papers were signed and the money had moved and the deed was in Earl's name, Grover Pell gathered his documents and said something about what a remarkable series of transactions these had been over the years. The kind of observation that an attorney makes when he has been present for something that he recognizes as being more than its legal components. Earl thanked him and stood up and put on his coat. He had one more thing to do. 3 days after the closing, he drove to Ames. He had not been to Ames in several years. He drove there in the early morning, arriving before 8, and found the address he had gotten from the Hardin County phone directory, a house in a residential neighborhood south of the university campus, with a small yard and a detached garage, and a driveway where a late model station wagon sat next to a compact car. He knocked on the door at 8:15. Colt Denton answered the door in work clothes on his way out to his job, and he looked at Earl with the surprise of a man who has not anticipated this particular visitor on this particular morning. Earl said he was sorry to come without calling. He said it would not take long. Colt said to come in. Earl said he would rather they talked on the porch if that was all right, and they stood on the front porch of the house in Ames in the October morning with their breath visible in the cold air and the neighborhood quiet around them. Earl said he had purchased the remaining Denton family land from Harlan the previous week. He said this was the land that Harlan's grandfather had built across 3 decades, the ground that the Denton family had worked for the better part of a century, the ground that Colt had grown up watching his father work, and that his children would know about through the stories Colt told them if he told them stories which Earl assumed he did. He said 400 acres of that ground is yours. Colt looked at him. Earl said, I am deeding you 400 acres free and clear, no payment, no strings, no conditions attached to the title. He paused. Your grandfather built something in Hardin County. Your father nearly lost it. That does not mean your family has to leave. The land knows your name. It has known it for a long time. That means something. Colt was quiet for a moment. He was looking at Earl with the expression of a man who is processing something that does not fit neatly into any category he has already prepared. He said, Why? Earl said, Because when I was at the county fair in August of 1979, I was not there to take anything from your father. I was there to show him something true. He eventually saw it. What I do not want, what I never wanted, is for that lesson to cost your family the land they built. What happened between your father and me is settled. What your grandfather built should stay in your family, if there is a way to make that happen. He said there is a way. Colt stood on the porch and said nothing for a long time. The neighborhood around them continued its morning, a dog barking 2 houses down, a car starting in a nearby driveway, the ordinary sounds of a residential street coming to life in October. He said, This is a large thing you are doing. Earl said, It is a fair thing. That is all. Colt said, I do not know how to respond to something like this. Earl said, You do not need to respond to it today. The deed will come in the mail next week. What you do with the land after that is your business. He shook Colt's hand. He walked to his truck. He drove back to Hardin County the way he had come on the state highway north through the flat land, the fields stretching away on both sides in their October colors, the corn cut and the ground bare and the sky very large and very blue above it all. He did not stop on the way home. He drove directly to the farm and parked in the yard and went to the barn. He stood with his hand on the engine block of the Farmall 560. The metal was cold. The morning light was coming through the east-facing window at the angle it came through at this hour in October, lower than it came in August, the angle of a season that has turned and knows it has turned clear and thin and without the warmth that the summer light carries. He stood there for a moment. Then he went inside to make his coffee. Colt Denton did not call to acknowledge the deed when it arrived. He did not write. He did not come to Hardin County in the weeks immediately following. Earl had not expected him to. He had not done what he did in order to receive a particular response, and the absence of response did not alter his sense of whether the action had been the right one. He had arrived at that sense through his own process, and it did not require external confirmation. The following spring, in the April of 1995, Earl drove past the 400 acres he had deeded to Colt Denton on his way to check on a tile line in the north field, and he saw equipment in the field. It was a tractor he did not recognize, a rental machine or a borrowed one, and the man driving it was someone he did not recognize at the distance, but who drove the machine with the particular attention of someone who is not entirely familiar with the ground he is working, who is learning it as he goes, feeling out its character, the way you feel out any new thing, carefully and with patience. Earl stopped his truck and watched for a moment. Then he drove on. The following year, the equipment in the field was a tractor that bore the Denton name on its mailbox at the field entrance, purchased, used the kind of machine that a man buys when he is starting something, rather than continuing something functional and affordable and appropriate to the scale of what he is beginning. Colt had taken a leave of absence from the engineering firm in Ames, according to what reached Earl through the normal circuits of county information exchange, and was splitting his time between Ames and the Hardin County ground. The year after that, he was in Hardin County full-time. The house in Ames was rented out. Colt and his family lived in a rented farmhouse on the east side of the county while he worked the 400 acres and made his decisions about what the land needed and how to give it what it needed, which is the fundamental problem of farming and the one that is never fully solved and never fully abandoned. He came to Earl's farm on a Saturday morning in October of 1997, 3 years after the deed had arrived in his mailbox in Ames. He drove up the long driveway and parked in the yard and got out of his truck and stood there for a moment before coming to the door, the way a man stands when he is preparing for a conversation that he has been thinking about for some time. Earl let him in. They sat at the kitchen table. Colt said, "I owe you something." He said, "I have been thinking about what it is for 3 years, and I am not sure I have the right word for it." He said, "I was angry when you gave me that land. I told myself I was not going to take anything from the man who had bought my family's ground." Earl looked at him. Colt said, "Then I took it, because I am practical even when I am angry, and because my children are going to have something because of it, and because the land is good land and I know how to work it, and it seemed like a waste to refuse it on principle when the principle was mostly about my own pride." He stopped. He said, "And because I thought about what my father said about you, what he told me in the hospital in 1994. He said you sat with him in the dirt in that cornfield for 14 minutes and talked to him the way a man talks to another man who matters to him. He said that meant something. He said he was glad you were the one who found him." Earl did not say anything. Colt said, "I am not sure I can explain why that mattered to me as much as it did. I just wanted you to know that I know what you did. Not just the land, all of it. What you did in 1979 and what you did in 1985 and what you did in that cornfield and what you did with the deed. I understand what it adds up to." Earl looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Harlan Denton's jaw on Colt Denton's face, and Harlan Denton's directness in Colt Denton's voice, and something else that was not Harlan at all, something that had perhaps been there all along in the Denton line and had simply not had the right conditions to express itself until now. He said, "Your grandfather put something into that ground. So did your father in his way, even the parts of it that went wrong. You are the one who has to figure out what to do with it from here. That is all any of us get to do. He said you are doing it, that is enough." They sat at the table for a while longer, not talking about anything in particular, which is the way that certain important conversations end, not with a summation, but with the ordinary continuation of two men in a room who have said what needed to be said and are now simply present with each other in the quiet that follows the saying of it. When Colt left, Earl walked to the barn. He stood with his hand on the engine block of the Farmall 560 and looked at the machine in the afternoon light. It was a machine that had been manufactured in 1961 and that carried inside its engine block the prototype components of a tractor that had never existed as a production model. The experimental work of engineers who were trying to understand what was possible before the production lines were committed to a particular possibility. It was a machine that had been sold as something ordinary and had revealed itself to the man who was paying close enough attention to be something considerably less ordinary than it appeared. It was a machine that had pulled a sled 300 feet in the preliminary round of the 1979 Hardin County Fair tractor pull and 287 feet in the finals distances that had established in front of 2,000 witnesses a truth about the relationship between appearance and reality that the county had been talking about for 18 years by that October afternoon in 1997, and would talk about for much longer still. It was a machine that had done nothing more than what it was capable of doing, which had been enough. Earl left his hand on the engine block for a moment. Then he nodded once, the same nod he had given it on the morning of August 18th, 1979. The morning before the fair, and on every morning before and after that, the small, complete acknowledgment between a man and the machine that had been his working partner for more than 30 years. Then he went inside. Earl Maddox farmed his land until he was 75 years old. His son, a quiet man named Lewis, who had grown up watching his father work, and had absorbed the approach to work, and to farming, and to the maintenance of machinery that Earl had spent his life developing, took over the operation in 2010, and ran it with the same methodical attention his father had brought to it, which was the only inheritance that Earl considered worth passing on. Earl died in the spring of 2012 at the age of 77. He had been in declining health for 2 years, a slow diminishment of the body that he bore with the same patience and the same absence of performance he had brought to everything else. He did not complain. He did not dramatize. He continued for as long as he was able to walk to the barn each morning and place his hand on the engine block of the Farmall 560, which by 2010 had been fully restored by his grandson, a young man named Paul, who had inherited his grandfather's mechanical inclination and who had spent 2 years stripping the machine to bare metal and rebuilding it with the attention to original specification that serious restoration requires. The Farmall ran better after the restoration than it had run in years. Paul had found things in the engine during the disassembly that Earl had never found or had found and accepted as within tolerance, and he had corrected them, and the machine emerged from the restoration with a quality of operation that was as close as possible to what it had been in 1962 when the engineers at International Harvester had installed their prototype components and sent it out into the world to accumulate the hours and the data that would inform the design of a tractor that would go into production under a different name, leaving this particular machine to find its way through the dealer network and into the hands of a farmer in Hardin County who would drive it for 2 years without knowing what he had bought. After Earl died, Lewis and Paul made a decision about the Farmall. They decided to bring it to the Hardin County Fair each August and park it near the tractor pull track where the competition continued to be held each year, because some things about county fairs do not change regardless of what changes around them. They built a small display around it, a wooden frame with a panel that told the story in plain language, the date and the bet and the competitors and the outcome and the secret of the engine block and what had happened in the years afterward. They did not embellish the sign. They did not editorialize. They wrote down what had happened and let it stand on its own, which is what the truth generally prefers. People stopped to read the sign. They came across it between the livestock barns and the midway and the food stands in the full August flow of a county fair, and they stopped and read it and looked at the machine with the particular expression that people wear when they are presented with evidence that the world contains things they had not accounted for. The tractor was beautiful after the restoration. Beautiful in the specific way that a machine is beautiful, when its design is honest and its function is clear and its history is visible in the way it has been used and maintained. The red paint was not the faded rust-streaked red of the fair in 1979. It was the deep, even red of a machine that has been brought back to itself, that has been given back the appearance of what it actually was. The stamp was still visible on the engine block. The test mule designation from 1962, the number that Harold Swick had decoded for Earl on a telephone call in the winter of 1971, was still there in the metal proof of what the machine was, of what it had always been underneath everything else. People read about it and shook their heads and smiled. They said what people say when they encounter a story that confirms something they already believe but rarely see confirmed so cleanly. They said that you cannot judge a thing by its outside. They said that the rust does not tell you about the engine. They said things that were approximations of the lesson, some closer and some further from the full weight of it. Colt Denton, who was in his mid-60s by the time the sign had been standing for several years, came to the fair each August. He walked through the fair grounds with the unhurried pace of a man who has been coming to the same county fair since childhood, and knows its geography and its rhythms the way he knows his own land. He stopped at the display. He stood in front of the Farmall 560 for longer than most people stopped. He never said anything to the people around him about his connection to the story on the sign. He simply stood there and looked at the machine the way a man looks at something that changed the course of his life, that changed the course of his family, that contains within its metal and its paint and its particular history more of his own history than most people looking at it would ever know. He looked at the engine block and the stamp from 1962. He looked at the baling wire on the left rear fender that Lewis had left in place during the restoration, a deliberate preservation of the detail that several people who knew the story had specifically requested, because the baling wire was part of it, because the baling wire was part of what a man with $45,000 in new equipment had seen and decided told him everything he needed to know. The wire was original. It had held that fender in place since 1974, and it held it still. Hard to believe, people said, standing in front of the sign in the machine in the August heat with the fair moving around them and the smell of the midway and the animals and the food in the air. Hard to believe that rusty old thing beat a brand new John Deere. They said it with admiration, with the pleasure of a story that comes out the right way. They were not wrong to say it. It had happened. It was on the sign. But the story that was hardest to believe, the part that people came back to in the conversations they had after they walked away from the display, was not the tractor pull. It was what had come after it. The man who had lost in front of 2,000 people, the man who had been humiliated and who had borrowed himself into a crisis and who had been sitting in his living room staring at the wall 3 days before his land was going to be auctioned away from him. And the man who had won, who had every reason to let the auction proceed, who had the money to buy whatever came available, and the legal right to do so, who had been called Junkyard and offered $500 for scrap, who had held the $10,000 check in his shirt pocket on the drive home and felt it as something he did not fully own. That man had driven to the house of the man who had done all of those things to him, and had sat down across the kitchen table and said, "I did not come to destroy you." That was the part that made people quiet. Not the horsepower hidden in the engine block, not the 9 feet of difference on a packed dirt track, not even the $10,000 check written in front of 2,000 witnesses. What made people quiet was a man in worn boots and a faded work shirt sitting across a kitchen table from the man who had laughed at him and saying, "This is not what I wanted. This is not the point of any of it. The land knows your name." That was what he had said to Colt Denton on a front porch in Ames in October of 1994, and it was what he had meant in the full sense of what those words can carry when they are spoken by a man who has spent his whole life understanding the relationship between the people who work the ground and the ground that receives the work, the reciprocal and patient relationship between a farmer and his land that is not ownership in the simple legal sense, but something more like stewardship, more like being the current holder of something that was here before you and will be here after you, and that deserves to be treated accordingly. Earl Maddox had understood this. He had understood it the way his father understood it, and the way his grandfather had understood it, the three of them passing it forward through the generations, the way certain kinds of knowledge get passed, not through instruction, but through example, through watching how a man does the things he does, and drawing from the watching something that words would only approximate. The Farmall 560 stood in the August light outside the Hardin County Fair each year, and people read the sign and looked at the machine and thought about what it meant. Some of them went away thinking about the engine, about the secret horsepower and the test mule designation and the engineer named Harold Swick, who had told a farmer in Hardin County the truth about what he was working with, and about the patience of keeping a secret for 8 years, until the moment arrived when the secret had somewhere to go. Some of them went away thinking about the bet, about what it means to be so certain of something that you cannot imagine being wrong, and about what happens to a man when the thing he was certain of turns out to be the wrong kind of certainty, certainty built on the visible rather than the actual, on the appearance rather than the nature of things. Some of them went away thinking about the kitchen table, about two men sitting across from each other in the years after the fair and the years after the foreclosure, working out between them a way of being neighbors that neither of them had expected, and neither of them had fully planned a relationship built not on liking or on shared history or on anything comfortable, but on a mutual acknowledgement of something true that they had arrived at by different routes and had been living with in different ways. And some of them went away thinking about the baling wire on the left rear fender, which was perhaps the truest emblem of all of it, the small and ordinary and unglamorous thing that held together what needed to be held together, that did its job without any claim to significance, that had been doing its job since 1974 and was doing it still simply because no one had found a reason to replace it with something more impressive. The baling wire was original. It had been there all along,